So let's take a look at network interface cards and how these Ethernet interfaces work, and then we take a look at how they are used in routers, and then maybe more details of their hardware and protocols. Okay, so remember that network interface cards used to be these plug-in cards that you would plug into a motherboard, and on one side, that's the outside, you would have a jack where you can plug in Ethernet cable. And that card, it used to be a card, but these days, of course, they're built into most computer motherboards these days, because pretty much every computer is going to be on a network, and so it makes sense to put it on a motherboard. So the NIC itself, I'll call it a NIC, that's Network Interface Card, and it sets up a connection between the computer and the network. And so there's hardware, and then there's software too running on the network interface card. They do fail occasionally, and so you might actually end up using an application that might require additional, more than just one NIC on your system, and so it's good to know how to install a NIC. So what does a NIC do? Basically, it gets these digits, binary digits, bits, zeros and ones, right? And so this represents a signal and time. So time is going to the right, and it can also represent like data, and data is transmitted between computers in a very specific format, and the one that we will look at in this course is a frame. So a frame consists of many binary bits or binary digits, bits, but we look at them as mostly as bytes. Okay, so this is the structure of the frame that we will look at. So a NIC provides a way for the computer to convert incoming physical signals, these are voltages, and then decode them as zeros and ones first, and then put them together into what's called a frame. That's the one that we will look at in this course. So what's inside this frame? There's a bunch of things before, and we'll take a look at more details of what of each of the bytes that are involved before the frame starts, and then at the end of the frame. But the main thing to look at right now is that the frame essentially starts with a destination MAC address. So that's the picture you want in mind, is there's a destination MAC address, and then there's a source MAC address, and then the rest of the data in the frame, followed by a frame trailer, which is a cyclic redundancy code, or it's also called a frame check sequence. Okay, so when a NIC receives these ones and zeros, and so if you think of this as the network interface, and this is where the Ethernet cable plugs in, you get zeros and ones. You get this first, and then this, and then so what you will see at the receiving end is 0, 1, 1. It's a little bit confusing because this is time, but if you look at it traveling, I guess, in this direction, you get the 0 first, and then the 1, and the 1, and so on. And then you can think of it as sort of going left to right in bytes. And so the first 6 bytes are going to represent the destination MAC address. Okay, so what the NIC will do is, as soon as it gets the destination MAC address from the frame, it will check. It's like the first thing in the frame pretty much. There's a little bit before that, but let's ignore that. It will check and see if the destination MAC address is the same as the NIC's MAC address. So every NIC will have a MAC address, and that's burned into the NIC in ROM by the manufacturer. So it verifies the destination address. Is this frame intended for me? If it is, then it will note the source address. It will remove this frame header, which is this first part, and then we'll look inside, and it'll see what's called a packet. So inside each frame is a packet, and it'll take that packet and send it up to the higher layers, is what we call it. So this is more NIC and hardware and a little bit of software running on the NIC. It'll extract the frame, that software will extract that frame and send it up to more layers of software. And in this case, it's the network protocol that will use the IP addresses in the packet. So you have a frame with a destination MAC address, source MAC address. Then comes the packet information, which has a destination IP address, source IP address, and then the data that you're intending to send, that was sent to you in this case. And at the end of the frame is a frame trailer, which is used to check and make sure that the rest of it was sent properly, that it was received properly. Okay. So an outgoing message, when you send out a message, then you do the opposite. You send out, you take a IP packet, network protocol packet with the destination IP, source IP, and the data, and then the NIC should know what the destination MAC address is, and let's just assume that it knows it. It will put that packet into a frame. So it constructs a frame with the destination MAC address. Source MAC address is the NIC's own MAC address. Puts the frame next. Puts the packet next, and then constructs a frame trailer, which is a code or a short representation of all of these bytes. So this can be like 1500 bytes. And then you sort of summarize this. You take the sum of everything, something like that, and then create what's called a cyclic redundancy code, which is a small 4-byte representation of this data. And that is going to be received when you send it out. The other end will get that frame. It will compute what the CRC or the frame trailer or frame check sequence should be, compares it to what this NIC sent. If they are equal, then you know everything worked. If they're not equal, then probably there was some electromagnetic interference, or maybe if you're talking about Wi-Fi, someone turned on a microwave and disrupted your message, introduced extraneous zeros or ones, and the message was wrecked, and so you have to retransmit in the end. Okay, so you get a packet. Once again, you get a packet from the higher layers, they're called software layer. It goes down to the NIC. The NIC creates, the software in the NIC creates a frame with destination MAC address that you're going to send to, and the source, that is your own MAC address, and then the information from the packet, and compute out the cyclic redundancy code or frame check sequence, puts it all into one frame and sends it out. Okay, and then the hardware, the electronics, converts those bytes, or I guess you can think of them as bytes or bits, and sends out electrical pulses. Okay, so NIC manufacturers, or the companies that make these network interface cards, have to make sure that every NIC has its own unique MAC address. So if you have two NICs on a network with the same MAC address, and that's going to be ambiguous. Who are you trying to send to? So you pretty much can assume that just about every NIC that you will ever encounter will have a unique MAC address. So let's just assume that for now. Of course, there's ways around it, but let's just say they are unique. So this is the way the manufacturers do it, is it's burned into read-only memory on the network interface card. So it's a 48-bit represented using hexadecimal numbers, divided up in two parts, two 24-bit parts. The first part is a vendor ID, or a OUI, and the second part is the serial number that's assigned by the manufacturer. So this 48-bit altogether, 224-bit quantities put together gives you 48 bits. Remember, 48 bits divided by 8, you get 6. That's the number of bytes. But each byte is 2 hexadecimal digits, so you get 6 times 2, which is 12 hexadecimal digits altogether. So don't let that throw you off. Each one of these things is a single byte. You remember that. Okay. So when a frame arrives at a NIC, the NIC has to check if the destination MAC address is the same as its own built-in in-ROM MAC address. And so there are three main possibilities. So if the frame MAC address, the MAC address for the destination of the frame matches your own burned-in address, then you are the intended recipient, and so you read the frame in, extract the packet, send it up, and also you check and make sure that the frame check sequence matches what you compute. The other possibility is that it was a broadcast address. So remember, all ones for a destination MAC address, or ones in hexadecimal would be FF, and so you have 6 sets of FFs. That's the broadcast address. Then it's meant for everyone on the local area network, and so you read it. The other possibility is that you are operating the NIC, or the user that's using the computer. That NIC on that computer may be operating in what's called promiscuous mode. That is basically saying, I'm going to listen in on all of the packets, all of the frames that are going to be received by me. So usually NICs don't do that, but because you can't really afford to listen in on all the conversations. But sometimes if you're debugging a network or you're snooping, then you can set the NIC to be in promiscuous mode and listen in on all the traffic. Okay, so if a destination MAC address matches the NIC MAC address, then it's a unicast frame. That's a single destination. It's intended for a single computer. You can also have broadcast and multicast. A broadcast is when you are sending a message to all the computers, all the stations on the LAN. And promiscuous mode basically turns off the gatekeeper function. You just ignore the fact that you're not, or you turn off the fact that you are only supposed to really read messages if it's in one of these two modes. You say, if in promiscuous mode, you ignore this. You don't check the destination at all. You just read everything. Okay, so you turn off the gatekeeper function and you process all the frames. Usually this is not something you want to do, just because your NIC will always be busy if there's a lot of traffic. It's used for debugging a network, for analyzing protocols, or what is called packet sniffer software like Wireshark. NICs typically have indicator lights, and they can come in all kinds of different kinds of lights. So it's not necessarily, this may not be what you might see on either on the switches or on the backs of your computers or your laptops. So it's usually green when you have a valid connection. If it's not, you'll see orange or yellow. Some NICs will have, most NICs actually support multiple speeds these days, like 10, 100, or 1,000. That is a gigabit per second speed. And so you might have separate lights for each speed, so that you can take one quick look at the back of the computer and figure out what the speed is. And so that will tell you the speed of the hub or switch that you're connected to, if you can tell what speed it's operating at. So for example, you might see amber for 100 megabits per second, or green, flashing green, usually for a gigabit or 1,000 megabit per second. These days, of course, NICs are built into motherboards, and sometimes maybe if you have, for whatever reason, you might want to have your laptop or desktop work as something like a router, and you can do that. You just have to plug in a second NIC, or else maybe you don't need a router function, but you just want it to work on a faster network, and so you might buy a faster NIC and install that in your computer. And so you want to make sure that the NIC is something that makes sense to connect to your motherboard using the bus, whatever bus that you're using. You may have to install a driver. So these are good things to know. You might want to take a look and see if you can use a better NIC in the machines that you already have. So if you installed Windows 10, you've probably seen this. Eventually you get to a point where you see the network connections, and then you have to change the properties of the network connection, of the Ethernet connection. These days you don't have to install drivers. Windows 10, for example, comes with a whole lot of drivers, and so it'll find the device that you're using and install the appropriate driver. So in the lab, you probably noticed that Windows 10 doesn't ask you to install a driver, because chances are, unless you have some really old hardware, it will find a suitable driver and it'll show you that driver basically as a network connection, and each one will have a name, and you can change the properties. You can right click and look at the properties and change settings, things like that.